There's a natural tendency for people to avoid addressing their own anger. So, for instance, in psychotherapy, in my field, the three main categories of negative emotion are fear, anger, and sadness. Simplistically, like we see a lot of frightened clients with anxiety disorders. We see a lot of depressed clients because those are inward-looking emotions where people tend to blame themselves excessively. And so they're quite motivated to go and seek help. But people who are angry, it's an externalizing emotion where blame is focused on others. So angry people don't think that they need therapy. They think you need therapy.
Right.
Like, you're the one that should be in therapy, buddy, not me. Like, the more angry people are, the more they tend to think everyone else has a problem.
I'm Ran Dror, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Today we talk about anger. Everywhere you look, it feels like outrage and anger are on the rise. Populist politicians win elections based on popular anger, and when they lose, they claim their elections had been stolen, to further sow outrage. Social media seems to feed on and amplify anger, so much so that we now have new names for the various things that people do when they are angry online. Words like cyberbullying, trolling, and doxing. At the same time, our political systems are becoming so extreme that it's now possible for some, even in long-standing democracies, to undermine the basic common agreements of a free society. The rule of law, respect for institutions, and the belief in truth. And in less established countries, civil war has become a growing specter, if not an everyday reality. And yet the dangers of anger have been identified eons ago. The Stoic philosopher warned that anger has the power to take away our reason, that it always costs far more than the offense which triggers it. Seneca wrote about anger that no plague has cost the human race more dear. The Stoics have also given us tools to deal with anger and other destructive emotions, which is why I was thrilled to sit down with Donald Robertson. Donald is an author, TED speaker, cognitive-behavioural psychotherapist, and trainer. He's one of the founding members of the Modern Stoicism nonprofit, and the founder and president of Plato's Academy Center in Athens, Greece. He specializes in teaching evidence-based psychological skills, and known as an expert on the relationship between modern evidence-based psychotherapy and classical Greek and Roman philosophy. His books include Stoicism and the Art of Happiness, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, and the graphic novel Verissimus, the Stoic Philosophy of Marcus Aurelius. We spoke in mid-December 2022, and I found Donald to be an engaging and fascinating speaker and a great explainer of Stoicism. What it is, who are the Stoic thinkers, and why should we care in this day and age about what they had to say. We talked about how he discovered Greek philosophy at an early age, why Stoicism was considered obscure and not taught for the longest time, and why it's having its resurgence these days. We talk about Stoicism as an ancient therapeutic tradition, the relationship between modern CBT and Stoicism. What is Stoicism? Who were the Stoics? The most common misconceptions about Stoicism. Then we dive into anger. Is anger good or bad? What did anger mean to the Stoics? What can we learn from the Stoics that can be applied to modern day? We talk about fear and anxiety in the Stoic tradition, and the view from above as a possible solution. We also talk about his books and his journey as a therapist and student of Stoicism. I love finding nuggets of very practical wisdom in ancient texts, especially when they line up so beautifully with what science has to teach us. And the Stoics are definitely a rich source for those insights. More than anything, I think their approach to anger could and should guide us in finding systemic ways to to making our technologies, communities, and institutions act as dampeners rather than amplifiers of outrage. We have some amazing episodes lined up for you, with thinkers, designers, makers, authors, and activists, answering questions like, why are more and more people around the world turning to co-living communities as an attractive idea? What do most people still need to understand about transgender and non-binary individuals? What's the importance of prototyping and prototypes? Does everyone need a manifesto? And what does it mean to have creative hustle? But before these episodes can get to you, they need to be edited, audio mixed, and published. And Remake is now in a time of transition as I'm preparing to move my life and business to the United States, with a lot of uncertainty around the future of the Israeli business. In order to keep our team running and protect the podcasts from the vicissitudes of life, politics, and business, we're asking for your support. If you value the podcast and the hard work that 5 different people are putting in on every episode, please consider supporting us at remakepod.org/support, or go to our website and click Become a Supporter. You can make a one-time donation or join as a monthly or yearly supporter, which will entitle you in the future to access any premium episodes, longer versions of episodes, video interviews, and a paid Remake newsletter. We have a lot of plans on how to make Remake into a real community and invest in more content, including short-form content. And of course, the podcast itself will always feature in-depth conversation with people who are trying to change our lives for the better. But right now, we really need your support. So once again, you can go to remakepod.org/support or go to our website and click Become a Supporter. And now let's jump right in with Donald Robertson.
All right. I'm sitting here with Donald Robertson. Donald, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to it.
Great. So we like to start by connecting to the present moment in our daily lives. And so I'd love to ask you what it's like to be you in the world today.
What it's like to be me. I just moved to Montreal, so I'm speaking to you from Montreal.
Nice.
And we had an eventful day yesterday. I moved to another Airbnb and we couldn't get in, so we were locked out in the snow for 4.5 hours with our cat.
Oh, no.
So that was fun. It's exciting. So we used the opportunity to do some questions and answers about Stoicism online, actually, from a coffee shop. But I'm a writer, so mostly I've been traveling a lot. I'm the founder of a non-profit in Athens, so I spend a lot of time in Greece. And I do a lot of work online these days. And I'm working on a book. I'm always writing, so I'm working on a book at the moment about Socrates. So that's kind of what my life consists of at the moment, I guess.
Amazing. So you said you divide your time between Canada and Greece. I was just in Athens in September for the first time. I spent 2 weeks in Athens and just fell in love with the city. It's wonderful. And I've been to the place where may have been Socrates' prison cell, and I walked around. It's a wonderful, very different climate from Canada, isn't it?
It's very different from Canada. It's the opposite in some ways. That's kind of why I like it. I like the contrast. So it's good to be able to go back and forth between the two. Athens is kind of a noisy and a little bit of a chaotic city in some ways, and that drives some people crazy, but I really like it.
Yeah, no, me too. I felt very familiar. It felt very familiar. I'm from Israel, so it felt like a very similar Mediterranean vibe, except with better art and a lot of ancient culture, and I super liked the food, and so it was very, very nice experience. So I'd love to start our exploration today by asking this opener question that we always ask, which is, what's something you learned early in life or in childhood that still drives or guides you today, that's still alive in you today?
To be honest, the thing that, I don't know if this is a learning or just an experience, but I wrote about this in my book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. The thing that shaped my life the most as a kid was that my father passed away when I was 14. And I dropped out of school and got into a lot of trouble with cops and things like that. I got kicked out of school. I got put on a rehabilitation scheme for young offenders, actually.
Mm.
So my life was, in that sense, definitely going off the rails for a while when I was like 14, 15, 16 years old. And that was when I discovered philosophies. And I'm not even 100% sure how. There are a couple of things. My father was a Freemason, and he left behind some books on Freemasonic symbolism that mentioned Pythagoras and Plato. So that made me want to go and kind of learn more about that. I started reading about world religions. I read about the Kabbalah, and I read lots of books about Christian apocryphal stuff like the Gnostic Gospels. And then I got into reading about Hinduism and Buddhism and things. And I discovered Greek philosophy as part of that process. And I think what it gave me somehow was a kind of, maybe a replacement father figure in a way, not to put it too simplistically, but it gave me a sense of direction that I just didn't have before. I didn't really have anybody to kind of tap me on the shoulder and point me in the right direction in life. And so philosophy gave me a way of thinking about my values and a sense of direction. And that's remained with me definitely to this day.
Was it immediately Stoicism, or did you go through different phases? How did it evolve?
Nobody tells you about Stoicism. Yeah, they do now on the internet, but they didn't when I was a young guy. Stoicism was just this kind of footnote, like in the history of philosophy in a sense, right? People talked about Seneca, but they were like, oh, and he was like a Stoic, incidentally. They didn't talk about Stoicism itself that much. And I studied the history of philosophy. I read Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy from cover to cover. And then I read a bunch of other books about the history of philosophy because I wanted to get a kind of overview of the subject. And I started reading all of the classics of philosophy. Some of them, it turns out, are quite boring. So I read Locke and Hume and Bishop Berkeley, and Kant is pretty hard going when you're 16. So I read a lot of different things. I liked Schopenhauer, I liked Nietzsche, I got into existential philosophy. Then I went to university and I did a degree in philosophy. And I studied Heidegger and Wittgenstein. We did courses in Plato and Aristotle, but they never mentioned the Stoics as far as I remember. So like many people, at least of my generation and before, even though I did a degree in philosophy, I didn't really properly discover the Stoics until after I graduated. Like one of the few major schools of ancient philosophy that's not really covered on a typical undergraduate philosophy curriculum. And the ironic thing about that is if you ask academics why that is, they'll say the Stoics don't really originate any new concepts or theories as such. They take concepts from Socrates and Aristotle, Plato, and other preceding philosophers, and then they figure out the practical application of them to everyday life as a sort of therapy, a philosophy as a way of life. And then they say, so, well, why would anybody want to study that kind of thing? And I thought, but that's precisely what people do want to study. Like, we want to know how you apply these ideas in practice. So that was how I discovered Stoicism. And I was getting into training in counselling and psychotherapy at the time. And I realised that Stoicism was the inspiration for cognitive-behavioural therapy. So that kind of came together quite nicely. I was also really into Buddhism. And I guess one way of putting it, this is a good way of explaining how things evolved for me. So I was reading Jung and Freud and a lot of psychology. I read a lot of self-help stuff. I went on Buddhist retreats. So I studied history of Indian religions as part of my philosophy degree. And I was practicing meditation and stuff. I was training in counselling and psychotherapy, but more in Freudian psychoanalytic therapy initially, and to some extent humanistic therapies. So I was juggling all these balls. I had all these plates spinning, like as a young guy, as you often do. And it's kind of driving me crazy. After 4 or 5 years, I was like, I don't feel like I'm any more, I've figured life out any more than I had before. I've learned a lot of really cool stuff, but I'm even more confused than I was before. And then when I discovered Stoicism, everything just crystallized for me because I thought these guys are philosophers. They're talking about contemplative practices and stuff, a bit like Buddhism and a bit like Indian yoga. I'm kind of getting that vibe from them sometimes. And it's also the basis of modern therapy. So I'm getting my philosophy, my meditation, and my therapy, my self-improvement stuff all rolled into one. And I remember thinking, this is awesome. I just need to read Seneca now. I don't need to read this massive pile of like other obscure texts that I was trying to work my way through. But I was kind of half joking. But I thought I found something that brings together all of my interests in a coherent way.
That's amazing. And so you mentioned in passing that Stoicism was the origin of CBT. Do you want to maybe tell me more about that? That's really interesting.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you the slightly more obscure version of it. Let's see. So when we started talking about Stoicism doing conferences, we got a bit of pushback from some academics, actually, because they were like, you guys are psychologists and therapists, and you're just kind of twisting ancient philosophy, or you're reading kind of psychotherapy into it, was what they said. And I thought, wow, these guys are ignorant of their own subject, because the medical model or the therapeutic model was always a really explicit and dominant theme in ancient philosophy, in Pythagoras and Socrates, in the many schools of Hellenistic philosophy, particularly more than anything in Stoicism. They talk about therapy. They wrote books on therapy. They're very explicit about the idea that philosophy is a therapy for the psyche or a therapy for the soul. It was a cliche, even in the ancient world. There was a book by Chrysippus, the third head of the Stoa, called On Therapeutics. It's about psychotherapy. That's lost, but we have another book that discusses it by Galen, Marcus Aurelius' physician, called On the Diagnosis and Cure of the Soul's Passions, which sounds like, and is, a book on psychotherapy. We have a surviving Stoic book on psychotherapy for anger called On Anger by Seneca, that's pretty well known, actually, today.
Wow.
So they already had a therapeutic tradition, which that might surprise many people. Now, skipping forward in time, I guess I'll say some other things that might surprise people that aren't familiar with the history of the subject, or may be controversial, that might shock certain people. So there are a lot of people that kind of assume that Sigmund Freud invented modern psychotherapy, and that's wrong on several counts. First of all, psychotherapy already existed in the ancient world, explicitly so. And secondly, Freud trained in therapy. So there were psychotherapists around before Freud even came on the scene. The tradition of psychotherapy that existed is sometimes called rational psychotherapy or persuasion psychotherapy. And its leading figure was Freud's main rival, a Swiss neurologist called Paul Dubois. And Dubois was really into Seneca and drew heavily on the Stoics. But now nobody is familiar with his approach or his writings because Freud eclipsed him in fame. So there was an initial rational cognitive approach to psychotherapy at the start of the 20th century. Many people practiced it. It was around for a while. It drew heavily on Stoicism, explicitly so, and then it kind of faded into obscurity. And then psychoanalysis dominated. Then in the 1950s, a New York psychotherapist called Albert Ellis, who had trained in kind of post-Freudian psychodynamic therapy, sat down one day basically and decided he was going to start again from scratch because it wasn't working for him. Like many people have done in different modes of psychotherapy over the years, they've got frustrated and thought, I want to reinvent this, it's not really working. Albert Ellis sat down and thought, what can I draw on in order to create a new approach to psychotherapy that I think, seems more common sense, more down to earth, that this Freudian thing's not really working for me. And he had read the Stoics as a teenager. I don't know if he'd read Seneca. He barely mentions Seneca. He'd read Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. So then he drew on those. He mentions Epictetus many times in his writings. But there was particularly one quote from Epictetus from a book called the Enchiridion, or Handbook. In passage 5, it says, it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them. And Ellis quoted that to all of his students. He taught it to all of his clients. And he mentions it in virtually all of the many books that he wrote. So it became a cliche in the cognitive therapy field. This particular quote from Epictetus, they thought this pretty much encapsulates, it simplifies the cognitive model of modern psychotherapy. And people remember it and they can relate to it. So it became a kind of cliche. When I started training in cognitive therapy, that's how things were. Everywhere you looked at books, every course you did, they would teach you this quote from Epictetus. And I thought, wow, these guys must be super into Stoicism. So I began researching it. I thought there are loads of parallels between ancient Stoic psychotherapy and modern psychotherapy. And I thought these cognitive therapists must be really inspired by that. And then I had the realization that this quote from Epictetus that they use all the time seemed to be, in fact, the only quote that they knew, which seemed really weird. Like, I thought, why haven't you read the rest of the Enchiridion? It was only like 20 pages. You could read it in an hour. Ellis is virtually the only one that quoted anything else. And then after his time, the rest of the authors and experts in that field just used that one quote and nothing else. And I thought, but there's loads more. And so I started to research that area and write books about it. And that's pretty much what I'm still doing today.
Yeah, that's incredible. And today I feel like the conversation is very different in that we've had many books, including your own, but in general, in the culture, Stoicism is having a moment. And I think podcasting probably had something to do with it because you can have these conversations.
Yeah.
And so I would love for you to maybe, if you can encapsulate, and I'm sure you've done this a million times, but try to define Stoicism as an overarching term and then help us understand why it's relevant today in our world today.
Well, I forget. Let's do a quick intro to Stoicism then, and I'll start off by saying who they were. Who are these guys you're talking about? And then what did they believe, and then what did they do? How about that? So I mentioned Socrates already as an important precursor of the Stoics. The founder of Stoicism was a Phoenician merchant, so he wasn't actually Greek. He was shipwrecked at Athens, so we call it a Greek philosophy, but the Greeks themselves weren't really sure that they viewed it as a Greek philosophy, funnily enough. They always saw it as kind of foreign import. Most of the subsequent teachers were also from abroad. I mean, possibly the majority of them were also Phoenician. So Zeno was a merchant. He traded dye, purple dye, like the Phoenicians were known for. And he lost his fortune in a shipwreck at sea and wound up at Athens. And he heard someone reading from Book 2 of the Memorabilia Socratis, which is a book by Xenophon, a student of Socrates. Now, weirdly, we still have that book, so we can go and look up what it says. And it's a famous speech from a sophist called Prodicus that Socrates is depicted recounting. And it's an exhortation to philosophy. It's meant to inspire you to become a philosopher. And so Zeno was inspired by this to go off and study all the major surviving schools. This is like a generation or two after Socrates had been executed. So philosophy was still a big thing in Athens, and Zeno went and studied different schools of philosophy. And then after a decade or so, he founded his own school in 301 BC, a building called Stoipoikale, or Painted Porch, after which the Stoic school gets its name. It's not named after him, but otherwise it would be called Zenonism, which it was briefly, but thankfully not. It's named after the Stoa, where they met. And there were many teachers of Stoicism. Stoicism came to Rome, and as the Roman Republic was on the ascendant, the Romans got interested in Greek culture. And of all the forms of Greek philosophy, Stoicism was one that resonated most with traditional Roman Republican kind of martial values. Augustus, the founder of the Roman Empire, was trained in Stoicism. Then Seneca, the tutor of Nero. Then Epictetus, who we mentioned, who was a slave, but who became the most influential teacher of philosophy in Roman history, arguably. And then finally Marcus Aurelius, who was a Roman emperor, was famous for being a Stoic. And those three figures, Seneca, Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, account for roughly 90% of the surviving writings that we have today. And of the writings that existed on ancient Stoicism, only about 1% survive today, if that makes sense. So we only have a tiny fragment of the Stoic writings. Most of them come from late Roman Stoics, and primarily from those three. I should mention also Cicero in the time of the Republic was a follower of another school of philosophy, but Cicero had studied at Athens and was incredibly knowledgeable about Stoicism. And so his writings are one of our main source for information about Stoicism, in addition to those of Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. He's almost like an honorary Stoic, if you like. It tells us a lot about Stoicism, even though he wasn't one. So that's a very potted history of Stoicism. And there, one other thing I'd mention is from Zeno to Marcus Aurelius is a period of nearly 5 centuries. So we're talking about a philosophy that spread over a vast geographic area from one empire to another, from the Athenian Empire of Pericles to the Roman Republic and subsequently the Roman Empire, and endured for 500 years, which is a lot longer than Marxism or psychoanalysis have endured as cultural movements, if you like. So it's kind of a big deal. So those are who those guys were. What did they believe? Well, because there were multiple philosophies of life at the time. So one way, how do we distinguish them? Because they have a lot in common. Well, they're usually distinguished by something called the telos, or goal of life, that they posit. So they said the most important thing, the ultimate goal of life, or as we might say today, in a sense, the meaning of life, according to the Epicureans, for instance, was hedone, or pleasure, which they define paradoxically as an absence of pain or discomfort, which they also call ataraxia. So that's one school, has that definition. Another school might define the goal of life as acquiring as much knowledge as possible. But the Stoics define the goal of life as arete, which means is conventionally translated as virtue, although I think a better translation would be moral wisdom, because it's inherently cognitive in nature. And so the Stoics think that our goal is to maximize our potential for grasping the truth and to attain a form of virtue called wisdom. And then when we apply that to our relationships, we'll exhibit dikaiosune, or social virtue, which is conventionally translated, but badly translated, using the English word justice. And then in order to act with wisdom and justice consistently throughout life, sometimes you're going to get scared, and that's going to prevent you from acting wisely and justly. Or sometimes you're going to succumb to temptation. So you're going to need courage and self-discipline if you're going to consistently act in accord with wisdom and justice. So that gives us the famous 4 cardinal virtues of Stoic philosophy: wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance, or self-discipline, basically. And that's the core of the philosophy. Now, Stoicism is it's a big, complex philosophy. There are many parts to it, but essentially it's a moral philosophy. Cicero, for example, tells us the cornerstone of Stoicism is the belief that virtue is the only true good. It's the most important thing in life. Now, the important thing about that is that society basically tends to tell us the opposite. Whether it was in ancient Greece or whether it's today, we hit the ground running. We're like little blank slates as children. We look at the adults around us and we think, gee, I guess life must be all about acquiring as many material possessions as possible and trying to improve your reputation and status among your peers, because that's what everyone else seems to be doing. Like, if you look around, I guess life is all about hedonism, narcissism, celebrity culture, consumerism. So we kind of get indoctrinated into the prevailing values of our dumb society, for want of a better way of putting it. And the Stoics and Socrates thought at some point a thinking person will start to question these values and wonder whether money in itself is intrinsically important, whether reputation is intrinsically important, or whether there's something missing from this that's more important, which might be a kind of moral wisdom or self-actualization, if you like. Now, there is, in addition to this moral philosophy, a massive, obvious, and simple consequence to that moral worldview, which is as follows. If I believed wholeheartedly that moral wisdom is more important than wealth or status, losing my wealth and status would be of relatively less significance to me. And that's the main stuff that people get upset about generally. So if Stoics really believed, first and foremost, what's a moral, ethical worldview, it would have an obvious psychological consequence. So they would develop what they called apatheia, but we call emotional resilience. And so over the intervening 2,300 years, the word Stoicism became almost synonymous with emotional resilience. Ironically, it's not the main thing that they wanted to achieve, but it's the most obvious consequence of what they wanted to achieve. And I suppose the other thing I should add to that is to undo something. So if you go on the internet, you'll find the most common misconception about Stoicism is that, for some weird reason, most of the ancient Greek schools of philosophy, we use their names today to mean something else. So the meaning of the names of most schools of Greek philosophy has become degraded in the English language. For instance, today, if I say I'm a bit of an Epicurean, that means that I go to fancy restaurants, and I like fine dining and stuff like that, right? I like to think of myself as something of an Epicurean. That doesn't mean that I follow an austere, ancient school of philosophy normally, right? It has these two meanings. And I guess we can distinguish whether we write it with a lowercase e or a capital E.
Right.
So if it's lowercase e, someone's probably just talking about gastronomy. If it's a capital E, they're probably talking about this ancient school of philosophy, which didn't teach fine dining and stuff. Cynicism. If I say, I like to think of myself as something of a cynic, like, that means something quite different from what it meant 2,300 years ago, where it referred to Diogenes of Sinope and this whole school of philosophy that developed from his teachings. Sophistry, academic, skeptic, all of these words mean something slightly different today because the meaning has become simplified and degraded into a caricature of what it originally meant in Greek culture. And Stoicism, similarly, today means, if we write it with a lowercase s, having a stiff upper lip, or to define it in psychological terms, because it's become a construct of considerable importance to modern psychology, lowercase s Stoicism means a personality trait or a coping style that consists in suppressing or concealing embarrassing or painful emotions. Right? So if I get anxious, that may be unpleasant and embarrassing. If I'm being lowercase stoic about it, I'll try and keep a poker face and I won't tell anyone about it. Like, I might even avoid situations that make me feel that way, try and hide it from people. Now, in some ways, that's kind of fake resilience, right? I have unpleasant feelings, I'm just trying to hide them or suppress them or cover them up, right? That's the opposite of what the ancient Stoics actually taught. Like, the ancient Stoics thought we should be unashamed and we should be indifferent to the feelings, but we should question the underlying beliefs that they're derived from.
Yeah.
Right? So we need to face our emotions and confront them in order to change them cognitively, not just try and force them down in a kind of dumb way without examining them. Now, I'm emphasizing this because it's of enormous practical importance. It's a widespread misunderstanding on podcasts and on blog articles and things like that today. And the main reason that people would criticize Stoicism today is that they confuse it with lowercase s Stoicism, the stiff upper lip coping style, or the unemotional coping style.
Yeah.
There are many modern research studies on lowercase Stoicism that show that it often has poor outcomes over the long term for mental health. Although people who try to have a stiff upper lip and be tough think of themselves as tough guys or whatever, they're actually more emotionally vulnerable. Paradoxically, it's the opposite of what they think. Like, they're more prone to depression and anxiety and, if you like, kind of breakdowns and stuff. Their coping is poorer for a bunch of quite simple reasons, which I won't delve into. We also have research that compares capital S Stoicism, the Greek philosophy, to lowercase s Stoicism. They're definitely two different things.
Two different things.
And one of them, capital S Stoicism, is the inspiration for CBT and evidence-based resilience training, which is good for your mental health, and the other is known to be bad for your mental health. So it would be a really bad idea to confuse something that's psychologically toxic with something that's known to be psychologically therapeutic. Those are two things you definitely would want to keep separate.
You're listening to Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. If you're listening on a podcast app, you already know how to follow podcasts. So please follow this one. If you're listening in a browser, just go to remakepod.org to find links to all the major podcast players where you can follow our show.
You gave a talk about anger that I felt was extremely relevant to what's going in the world today and what's going in Israel today and what's going on in many countries today. And you started with telling a story about Emperor Hadrian, and I would love to hear maybe that story and then tell me how the Stoics viewed anger.
Well, I think anger is bad, and so did the Stoics. Some people think anger is good. To put it kind of glibly, that's the beginning of the debate, and it's a serious point that I'm making. The story about Hadrian is that he lost his temper. Galen tells us a story, and he lashed out. He had a metal stylus in his hand, and he stabbed a slave in the eye with it and blinded him. And he felt bad about it afterwards, like probably because the other people around him were aghast at what they'd seen him do. And so Hadrian said to the guy, listen, I'm sorry that I stabbed you in the eye with a stylus. Is there anything that I could possibly do to make it up to you? Just trying to make reparation, right? And the guy said, all that I want is my eye back, which is the one thing that even the Emperor Hadrian couldn't actually give him. So the moral of the story for Galen is that sometimes the consequences of our anger are irreparable, and that the damage that we do, like, therefore, can be much more serious than we anticipate. We destroy things sometimes when we're angry. We destroy relationships in a way that can be complete. We say things that we can never take back sometimes when we get angry. So the Stoics believed that anger is based on certain beliefs and attitudes which have propositional value. They might be true or false. So the belief that somebody has acted unjustly, the belief that they've harmed you or threatened to harm your interests, and the belief that they deserve to be punished. And another way of putting it is, like many other schools of Hellenistic philosophy, the Stoics believed that anger was structurally related to the desire for revenge, but they class anger as a form of desire. The Stoics thought that anger was always problematic because it biases our thinking. They say anger is temporary madness. Our reason goes out the window. We don't think straight when we're angry. Now, Aristotle and his followers, certainly Aristotle's followers, had an opposing view of anger. They thought there might be such a thing as righteous anger or moderate anger, which could be helpful because it might motivate people to address injustices in life. And the Stoics thought that was ridiculous, because it was like saying that you could motivate yourself by becoming mildly neurotic or mildly biasing your judgment temporarily, if they believe that anger isn't inherently problematic in that regard. There's a large body of modern literature on anger which does corroborate this idea that it tends to bias our judgment in a number of crucial ways. And one is, for example, that people, when they're angry, typically underestimate threat. So that would mean that someone who's angry would expose themselves to danger. So an angry soldier will charge at the enemy, which is great, but he'll probably just get shot down, right? And he may also then endanger the other soldiers that are in formation beside him by breaking formation. So Marcus Aurelius talks about this, for example. And the Stoics thought, look, anything that anger can do, reason can do better. You could be acting out of love to defend your friends rather than hatred and aggression towards the enemy, for example. Like, by allowing anger to overwhelm us, we inherently become more irrational and we're more likely to do foolish things then, is what they thought, in contrast to the Aristotelians. A good way of explaining that today is there's a meme that says, drink coffee, do stupid things faster and with more energy. And that's kind of the Stoic critique of the concept of righteous anger. Like, people say, well, anger can motivate you, and the Stoics would be like, yeah, get angry, do stupid things faster and with more energy, because of the problem of anger affecting our judgment. So those are some of the debates that they had around it. That's only a small fragment. Like I say, Seneca has an entire book about the concept of anger and the therapy for anger. But I think it's fair to say, this because I know most people would agree with. This is one thing that I think most people would agree with, that our modern life, to a large extent, is online now. And our online life has become very obviously affected by anger because there's trolling and partisan political bickering and flaming and abuse and harassment online that didn't really exist in the same form before. It's more salient, at least. And it's something that's on people's minds more because of the way that they're encountering it online. And I think everybody can see that one of the risks with anger in politics is that it potentially leads to a breakdown in dialogue, and it seems to encourage extremist views. You get a kind of bifurcation of political discourse increasingly into two extreme viewpoints. And the Stoics thought anger was the most dangerous emotion for that reason, and the one that we most need to urgently address. But I would say it's also the most neglected emotion, for a very simple reason. First of all, anyone can look and you can see the internet is awash with self-help advice. There's more self-help advice now than ever before. We didn't have 1% of this when I was a kid. People are buried under a deluge of self-help podcasts and blog articles and stuff now. And yet, people don't seem any less neurotic than they were when I was a kid. So why isn't this huge mountain of self-help literature having massive benefits on our society? And I think one answer is that people are using self-help and self-improvement to address the wrong problems in many cases. There's very little discussion of people tackling their own anger. There's some, but it's only a tiny fraction. And there's a natural tendency for people to avoid addressing their own anger. So, for instance, in psychotherapy, in my field, the three main categories of negative emotion are fear, anger, and sadness. Simplistically, like we see a lot of frightened clients with anxiety disorders. We see a lot of depressed clients because those are inward-looking emotions where people tend to blame themselves excessively. And so they're quite motivated to go and seek help. But people who are angry, it's an externalizing emotion where blame is focused on others. So angry people don't think that they need therapy. They think you need therapy.
Right.
Like, you're the one that should be in therapy, buddy, not me. Like, the more angry people are, the more they tend to think everyone else has a problem. And so angry people don't usually jostle up at the door of a psychotherapist to do something about it, unless they're dragged along by their ear, by their spouse, or
the court.
It's in an institution. Like a prison or schools or the military or by the court system, and it's mandated, or they're referred by somebody else. And then it may be reluctantly, right? So the angry people are therapy dodgers. Like, they've got an emotion that they should be addressing, but they're often really reluctant to do it. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so urgent, like, that we somehow make more inroads into channeling self-help and therapeutic resources towards dealing with anger.
Yeah, that's a really powerful point. So I want to dive a little bit into it. There's as many other topics that I would love to cover, but I think this is an important one. And so you talked about the connection between anger and how we judge things. So it's not, the anger is not about the thing, it's about our judgment of it. And yet, having values and being discerning of how these values play out in the world is important, or I would argue it's important to make decisions and move in the world. And so many of us might be tempted to see things as a choice between anger and resignation, or lying down and letting abuse continue. So what is the recommended relationship to values and to boundaries without succumbing to anger?
So you're asking me what would be the alternative to anger?
I guess I am, yeah.
Basically, yeah. What would be better? What have we got instead? And that reminds me of the 1970s. There's a really cool graph that shows that you can pull up on search data or from Google Ngram, and show the frequency of references to the word mindfulness, which kind of increases from the 80s and 90s onwards. And it around about the late 90s, if I remember rightly, it eclipses references to assertiveness, because assertiveness was like the hot topic in self-improvement in the 1970s and early 1980s. And then everyone forgot about it, and they moved on to mindfulness. And assertiveness was really a clunky term. It's not a great term, but it means pro-social, rational communication, like skills, broadly speaking. Like, it's contrasted with aggression or anger. So it's how to get your point across to other people without actually becoming angry or aggressive. So a very simple answer to that would be, if you cast your mind back to when assertiveness training was a thing. Like, proper assertiveness is supposed to be the rational alternative to anger or aggression in social situations. There are a number of strategies that entails, but basically it's not about being passive. And I would argue, in every assertiveness trainer would argue, it's almost the other way around. Like, in a sense, people give in when they become angry. Like, they're allowing themselves to give in to their anger and be guided by it rather than using reason to guide them. And when we use reason to guide ourselves, when we think more carefully about how to communicate effectively, we can communicate in more powerful and more effective ways with other people. We can make sure that we're heard. We're less likely to be heard if we yell at people and throw our toys out of the pram and get upset. It's simply not the most effective way of communicating in most situations. There may be some exceptions to that, but I'll set that aside for now. There are more effective ways to communicate. However, there's a paradox at the heart of Stoicism, which is that has to be reconciled with accepting a kind of realism about the fact that the behaviour of other people isn't directly under our control. Now, one of the main pitfalls in assertiveness training is that you can train people through role play and pencil and paper exercises and visualization exercises for weeks and weeks. And then they go out and communicate in a really clear, lucid, rational, assertive, pro-social way with somebody. And the other person spits in their face or tells them to go jump off a bridge or F off or whatever, right? Because you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Like, you can't force other people to comply with your assertiveness. People will surprise you, and sometimes they can be antisocial and sometimes they can be obstinate. Now, this is a big deal because when people learn pro-social skills, sometimes, very often, at that point, they'd be tempted to give up. And then they just get angry as well. This isn't working. And they get angry and they get frustrated. And the Stoics, part of their philosophy is saying, look, you have to take responsibility, you have to take ownership of your own character, right? And you have to balance that with accepting that the consequences of your actions aren't entirely under your control. Your aim should be to do what's effective, right? To improve society and benefit other people. But you can't get frustrated and give up if it doesn't always work out, because that's just life. Like, you don't have absolute control over other people. You have to accept the fact that other people are sometimes going to ignore you or act in antisocial ways towards you. And then you can set boundaries, or you can take other action to protect yourself or remedy the situation. The Stoics believe, and Socrates believed, that when people get angry, like, typically they want to hurt the other person. Like, to simplify it somewhat, but often, typically when people get angry, they want to punish that. But you've done something wrong and you deserve to be punished. I'm going to teach you a lesson, buddy, which is a weird euphemism for saying that you want to hurt somebody. You know, nobody literally means that they're going to enlighten the other person when they say, I'm going to teach you a lesson. So it's an odd phrase to use. But Socrates and the Stoics would say, actually, that's what we should be trying to do. We should be trying to reform and educate people first and foremost. And actually, sometimes you might have to punish somebody, but the goal would be different. The goal of punishing somebody, like sending a kid into timeout or something like that, would be to try and protect them or improve their behaviour. And you would only do it in such a way or to such an extent that it might actually have a therapeutic or a beneficial effect on them. But for some people, punishment becomes an end in itself. Like, it becomes retaliation or vengeance. And the Stoic, that's a natural tendency that we have, and the Stoics want to warn us against that, and warn society against that, and try and drag us away from that and towards this more pro-social approach where the primary goal is to benefit other people by granting them the same kind of wisdom, moral wisdom that we are aspiring to ourselves.
The other emotion you mentioned is fear, or I would say anxiety is probably how we encounter fear most often.
Yeah.
What can Stoicism teach us about anxiety and fear and how to deal with that?
There are many things that the Stoics say about fear or anxiety. We can distinguish fear and anxiety, but most people don't, so it's probably not worth it. So one thing they would say, gosh, there's a bunch of things. Let's see. First of all, the most important thing from my point of view is that the Stoics distinguish between voluntary and involuntary aspects of our emotion. Now, to back up a little bit, I'll be brief about this, but I think the biggest problem that people face in terms of tackling their emotions, before we even get into techniques or anything like that, is there's a lack of awareness that most people suffer from because we have a primitive emotional vocabulary. So we don't even understand how our emotions work. You know, what chance do we then have of using self-help techniques and stuff like that to do? We have a caveman view of emotions. The Stoics make the easiest possible distinction the most fundamental distinction between aspects of emotion that are voluntary and aspects that are involuntary. Most people blur that distinction. So I can tell you from the point of view of modern psychotherapy, you can understand many problems, particularly anxiety-related problems, as people trying too hard to control involuntary thoughts and emotions and failing to take responsibility for or underestimating their potential control over voluntary aspects of their emotion. Many people could make a lot of progress. I mean, many people's problems can be solved or drastically improved just by becoming much clearer about the distinction between what we call today the automatic thoughts and feelings and the voluntary aspects of anxiety in particular. I'll give you an example. If somebody has generalized anxiety disorder, their heart beats fast and they sweat because they get anxious. Those are autonomic physiological responses. They're basically automatic in nature. They're a reaction to the things that you're doing voluntarily, or it could be because you drank too much coffee, or it could be the blue cheese you ate last night, or it could be any number of other things, right? But they're largely automatic when they initially happen. So people try to respond to them by taking drugs or alcohol, watching porn or TV to distract themselves, or trying to kind of block out or like these emotions, try to force them down or suppress them. And doing that means that they avoid being able to process the emotions naturally, and it means they exert a lot of energy trying to struggle against the emotions, which then leads on to other problems. Like, for example, in a social situation, if someone's trying really hard to suppress their anxiety, they'll forget what they're trying to say, and it'll make them feel awkward in the interaction. They won't be able to pay as much attention to the person that they're talking to or respond to social cues. So this is one of the things that kind of fuels social anxiety, for instance. So this causes a lot of problems. It would be better to accept the fact that your hands are sweating. It would be better to accept the fact that your heart's beating fast and shrug it off with indifference, is intrinsically meaningless, and be unashamed of it. And if you could do that, it would remove a whole layer of additional anxiety, and those feelings would probably go away naturally, more quickly. You're maintaining them or pouring fuel on them by struggling against them. On the other hand, we know that when people with generalized anxiety come into therapy, if we say, how strongly, from 0 to 100%, would you agree with the statement, my worry is uncontrollable? They'll typically say 100% or 95%. That's characteristic of people with severe pathological worry, which is a type of anxiety disorder. And they're wrong, because worrying, by which we mean a kind of chain of thoughts that can go on for 10, 20, 30 or many hours, is a slower, higher level cognitive process where there's a sequence of thoughts that can be interrupted or modified. So it's inherently more under voluntary control. And usually they just don't know how to exert control over it. So this bit, they can control and should control. And most other people do control. If you're lying in bed at night, you're trying to get to sleep, and you start worrying about a bill you suddenly remember that you haven't paid, the natural thing to do would be to go, hey, I'm trying to get to sleep. I'll think about this tomorrow morning and set it aside. And some people can do that fine. And other people find it really hard to do that. People with generalized anxiety disorder find it virtually impossible to do that. So they also tend to have incipient insomnia, they have problems falling asleep, right? But in many situations, if you were playing chess, if you're standing up to give a speech and you suddenly started to think about, what if I get sick? Or, what about this, when my business goes bankrupt? You think, I have to think about this later. I'm busy right now. So it's natural to set aside intrusive, our train of thought in response to intrusive thoughts in situations like that. And many people lose that skill. So there's a combination of trying too hard to control involuntary things and not taking enough control over the voluntary aspects of it. I thought that's just one specific example, but that's a way in which Stoicism can benefit people with anxiety. Another way, very briefly, because it's a common technique, is a thing we call the view from above. So this kind of links into some of the things we said earlier about distortions and anger. When people get highly emotional generally, one of the most common distortions they engage in is selective thinking, like confirmation bias and stuff like that, right? So the more emotional people are, the more selective their thinking tends to be. They get tunnel vision more and more. And people with anxiety engage in a type of thinking called threat monitoring, where they'll automatically look for possible signs of danger in their environment. They get really good at it. And in someone else's behavior, they'll look for threat signals, but through a kind of magnifying glass. And they'll go look for things to be more anxious about, right? But the downside, you might spot things that other people have missed, but the downside of that is you're ignoring the context. So you might be ignoring the fact that there's other aspects of someone's behavior that would place a different interpretation on the thing that you're getting worried about, or that would moderate it, for instance. There might be sources of threat in your environment that become meaningless or unthreatening when you acknowledge what we call safety cues in the environment, reasons to feel safe that are in the environment as well, that you're ignoring because you're just looking for danger. So the Stoics knew that narrowing our attention was problematic, and so they trained themselves to expand the scope of their attention in a number of different ways. But one of them is just by visualizing what the situation would look like if you saw it from very high above. And this is a thing they did seemingly every day to train themselves to broaden their attention and see things as more part of a bigger context. Anxious, angry, and depressed people tend to do the opposite.
Yeah, that sounds like a very powerful tool. So I wanna talk a little bit about your books, and you've written many books. The recent couple ones that are out are about Marcus Aurelius, and I'm especially really interested in Verismus, which recently came out in graphic novel form. So I'd love to hear, first of all, where the fascination with Marcus Aurelius comes from. What's so compelling about his figure, and then why choose the graphic novel form to explore his life?
Well, it started because of my daughter, who was like 5 or 6 at the time that I started working on these things, and I ran out of stories to tell her. She used to make me tell her lots of stories about Greek mythology, and I ran out. I started to tell her stories and anecdotes about Greek philosophers, which there are a lot of, surprisingly. And she got really into it. And then I'd already written some books about Stoicism, and I was asked to write another book about Stoicism by a publisher in New York. And I thought, well, how can I do this? Like, I have to figure out a different way of doing it. I can't just write yet another introduction to Stoicism, because loads of people are writing those. And so I sat down and I thought, is there a better way to teach people about Stoicism? And I thought, how do I teach my little girl about philosophy and stuff? I tell her anecdotes, I tell her stories. And I thought, would the Stoics agree with this? And I thought, yeah, 100%. The Stoics thought the best way to learn Stoicism wasn't from books or lectures. It was from getting to know real people that employed it. In fact, Seneca talks explicitly about this very idea. It's from role modeling. They thought that you mainly need. That's a problem for us because they're all dead now, right? But in the ancient world, they said you need to go and find a Stoic philosopher and follow them around and see how they live their life, and then you'll learn by modeling them. So ironically, they're all dead, but we have the books now, which they thought were the inferior way of learning philosophy. So I thought, okay, the Stoics would back me up on this. And then I thought, well, who? Zeno, the founder of Stoicism. He's the obvious guy to write about. And we have a few cool anecdotes about him, but I thought, it's not enough for a book. And then I thought, well, okay, who's the Stoic that we know most about? Now, funnily enough, some people have said to me that they think we don't know much about Marcus Aurelius, but those people are wrong. Because he was what I technically refer to as a big deal back in the day. And therefore, we have 3 major surviving histories of his reign. We have a cache of his private correspondence. The Meditations itself is quasi-autobiographical in a sense. It's his personal notes to himself. And the first chapter talks a lot about his relationships with other key people in his life. And we have a record of his legal rescripts as well. We have many sculptures of him. We have inscriptions about his reign. We have numismatic evidence. So we know way more about Marcus Aurelius than we do about probably any other ancient philosopher, to be honest. Certainly way more than we do about any ancient Stoic. I thought, I guess he's the obvious choice then. And I thought, could you have a story about Marcus Aurelius? It'd be kind of cool. And then I thought, he's already in Gladiator. Richard Harris plays him in the first act of the movie Gladiator. And so I thought, okay, by this point I persuaded myself that this idea made sense. And then I wrote a self-help book called How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. And my publisher were a little bit wary of it at first. They said to me, Donald, you know when we sell a book to a bookshop, there's a bookshelf labelled self-help, and there's one labelled philosophy, and there's one labelled psychology, and there's one labelled history, and one labelled biographies. And we can't put your book on all of those shelves. You have to pick a genre normally. So they weren't sure whether mashing up genres like this would work, but it did. That book sold, it's approaching 200,000 copies now.
Nice.
And it's been translated into 18 languages. So it's still going strong after whatever it is, 2 or 3 years now. So that was a self-help book I wrote about Marcus Aurelius. And then I wrote a graphic novel about him. And then I wrote an academic biography of him for Yale University Press, which won't be out until next year.
Nice.
The graphic novel Verissimus came out recently. So that's what inspired me to pick him. And also I think that he's a very interesting historical character. His life is very dramatic. And it's cinematic, and it's a story that I think people weren't all that familiar with.
Yeah, the graphic novel, first of all, it's beautiful and it feels cinematic, and it kind of has this inherent suspense of his life. It starts with him on his dying bed and then traces back kind of like a flashback to his childhood. And so what was it like to work on something so different from your normal writing assignment? What are some experiences?
Well, it was pretty wild, because I stumbled into it by chance. I got messaged on Facebook years ago by a guy in Portugal who was an illustrator who'd done a graphic novel of the Assemblywomen by Aristophanes, a guy called Zeno Fraga. And he just approached me because he'd seen my books and he thought, are you interested in something like this? And I forgot all about it. I couldn't really see the opportunity. And then sometime later, I got in touch with him and said, why don't we just do 3 little web comics, like just 10 panels each, just to promote some courses that I'm running. And then, long story short, I did a giclée high-quality art print of some of the panels and exhibited it at a conference. And a senior editor for a major publisher saw them, and he said, hey, have you got more of these? And I showed them the webcomics, and they said, do you want to do a graphic novel? And so totally by chance, I stumbled into being asked to do a graphic novel.
Right.
And I joke about this because we had long discussions and we spent a long time putting together the proposal, and we got the deal to do the graphic novel. And at no point did anybody ever ask me, Donald, have you ever read a graphic novel? Because the answer to that question would have been no. Like, not for a long time anyway. I read them maybe when I was a kid. And we spent initially naively, when you write a book, you're given a year normally. It took us 2.5 years to do this. A graphic novel like that takes a lot longer than a normal book. I spoke to the guys who did a best-selling graphic novel about the history of logic.
Logic Comics, yeah.
Logic Comics.
I read it. It's a wonderful book, yeah.
And just in the conversation, the illustrator mentioned in passing that it took them 7 years to complete. And my jaw kind of hit the floor. I thought we were going to finish it in just over a year. But we worked really rigorously on ours, and to try and get it done quickly. We had monthly targets and like a machine, and we got it done in 2.5 years. I went to Greece, I went to Carnuntum, to the Legionary Fortress, where I spent a week there shooting video and taking photographs. I visited countless museums, and we worked with a number of historical experts to try and get it as accurate. We did things that people wouldn't maybe imagine, like the dialogue was important to me. So I studied Roman letters and poetry. Poetry is a good way to get kind of vernacular expressions. Like, you think, how do people say farewell, or how do they insult each other, or how would they exclaim surprise, and how would they swear an oath, and things like that. And so by studying Marcus Aurelius's letters and other letters of the period and poetry and sources like that, we kind of figured out how to make the language more authentic. And there are also lots of battles in it, so we kind of leaned into that. When we were halfway through, we didn't intend to do this, but it suddenly dawned on us that we kind of almost written a prequel to Gladiator.
That would be great, because Gladiator, one of my favorite movies, and it definitely needs more philosophy, more background on Marcus Aurelius.
I saw in an interview that Russell Crowe is really into Marcus Aurelius, and I read somewhere that he wanted there to be more references to the meditations in Gladiator, but they decided against that in the end. the studio have greenlit the sequel to Gladiator now, and there's a scriptwriter working on it who's read How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. So I'm hopeful. I think it's possible the sequel to Gladiator might have a little bit more reference to philosophy in it. Fingers crossed.
That would be amazing. Sev, one final question that we always ask at the end of a conversation. So in his TED Talk, the philosopher Alain de Botton talks about the difference between a lecture and a sermon. And he sort of longs for the days of sermons, because he describes lectures as dry, factual, and a sermon is something that grabs you and tries to change your life and is an urgent plea to change your life. So if you had a chance to give a short sermon, what would it be about?
It would be about anger, what the Stoics have to say about it, and what the remedies for anger might be, and what the alternatives to anger might be. And I'll refer people to Book 11, Passage 18, in the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, where he lists 10 distinct cognitive strategies for coping with anger. And I think if I was going to pick one simple strategy for dealing with anger, probably the most powerful one actually isn't the cognitive techniques that he mentions, but a behavioural one that Epictetus mentions, which is that if you can spot anger early, if you can catch the early warning signs of anger, it's much easier to get your feelings to change course. It's better to nip it in the bud before it begins to escalate. Mm. And if you're getting angry, I might notice that your voice has changed, or I might notice that your look in your eyes has changed, or your facial expression. But the strange thing is that when people are getting angry, they don't notice these things. Even people that practice Buddhist mindfulness, for example, are oblivious, like have this blind spot, like that's obvious to other people looking at them and listening to them. So I would say, think about how you come across to other people. Think about the sound of your voice. Think about the look in your eyes and your facial expression, and train yourself to become much more deeply self-aware of what we call the early warning signs for anger. Because then half the battle will be won if you can spot the feelings beginning to arise at an earlier stage than you normally do.
Thank you very much, Donald. It was a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you very much for inviting me on the show.
Remake is produced by myself and Regina Rothstein. Research and editing by Louis Brady. And audio engineering by Greg Cocoveos. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also just makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We're a global strategic design sprint agency aimed at improving outcomes through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone, and see you next week on Remake.